This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
This is the last of our sessions this year, and we're starting, I have the programme for those who haven't received it yet. For next term, we're starting again on the 14th of October, but there is some time before that. And particularly now, I am requesting you all to pay full attention for the next 2 hours, or an hour and 3/4. Our speaker, James Kelly from Indiana University, has a very interesting set of ratings on Rate Your Professor. He not only requires people to attend every class of the course he runs, with which of course we feel deep sympathy, but he also likes people to stay awake during his classes.
I'm so demanding these days.
I'm pleased to say that after this complaint, a torrent of other students went online to defend him and say what a great tutor he was. Now, but just in case, don't fall asleep today. It's a hot day. Now, James is a polymath. He's interested in the history of architecture, which we're going to hear today, also gender, masculinity, comparative imperialisms, and I was thrilled to see history of the environment, rivers of the Anthropocene. That really struck a chord with me because recently I'd been at a conference in Bulgaria where they proposed that the topic should be the lower Danube. Very, very gently we said we thought that was perhaps a little bit minor for an international conference. And I said, no, there's no end of things you can say about the Danube. But if you insist, we'll make it the middle and lower Danube. Anyway, after a lot of fuss, we made it comparative river systems. And it proved to be an absolutely sparkling topic and sparkling conference. So I was delighted to find that rivers have their expert projects. And you don't have time to tell us in detail, but this is presumably, is it a multidisciplinary project?
It is, from the sciences to the arts. We just had our first exhibition this month. It's open, but you have to go to Indiana to see it. So.
Right. Well, provide us the funding and we'll all go. Anyway, there we are. We have a polymath talking to us today, and the theme he's particularly chosen is Neoclassicism and Florentine Freemasonry. So, without more ado,
thank you,
James, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up today on this really warm, sticky day. I feel like I brought a little bit of the Indiana weather with me, except when I left Indiana, it was about 96 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's still a little bit warmer in Indiana. The presentation I want to give today, despite having a river on the slide, is not about the rivers of the Anthropocene project, although I had thought about that as a potential subject. But today I thought I'd give a little bit of about my current book project on Georgian classicism and Nicholas Revet. This is from chapter 2 of my book, in which I never speak about Nicholas Revet. So you're not going to hear any more about Nicholas Revet than you've just heard, except that he's the topic of my next book. What I'm trying to do in this chapter is establish the Italian context in which Nicholas Revet went into when he arrived in Rome in 1741. So what you're going to hear today is a lot of information about Rome from the 1730s, Italy in the 1730s, in particular Florence. Really what I'm trying to do in this chapter is set up the socio-political context of Italy in the 1740s. There's been a good amount of material written in Italian, but that context for British grand tourists, I think there's still a lot of material to be mined, and that's what I'm doing in this book. So I want to begin with the structure of the story today. In summer of 1732, a group of British grand tourists arrived in Florence, and while they were there, they founded the first Freemason lodge in Italy. The lodge's membership shifted over the course of the next several years, as you can probably imagine, with the comings and goings of grand tourists. But a core membership remained in Florence, and some of these were part of the Italian literary elite. Some of these were English residents in Florence. The lodge was dissolved in 1739, when the papacy used what was left of its dwindling religious and political authority to attempt to arrest members of the group. And in fact, they did arrest one Italian member of the group, a poet by the name of Tommaso Crudeli. He was arrested, he was tortured while he was in prison, and when he left prison, he had contracted tuberculosis and died soon thereafter. So it was an incredibly painful and deadly experience for Tommaso Crudeli. This brief moment from 1732 to 1739 in Florentine history is rich in material, specifically about the Freemasons, which might be a bit surprising. We have letters about a commemorative medal that they had stamped in 1733, and you're going to see that medal today. We have the diaries of one of the members. His name is Antonio Cocci. He was a doctor, and pretty much if you were British or Irish and came through Florence, you saw Antonio Cocci. He was elected a member of the Royal Society in 1736. He was an antiquarian as well. And we have, of course, a huge number of documents, letters, trial transcripts from the Inquisition of Tommaso Crudeli as well. So we have a pretty rich documentary number of sources. The lodge existed during the final years of the Medici. Gian Gastone de' Medici was the Grand Duke. He brought an end to the Medici line in 1737 when he died. And so this moment in Florentine history kind of makes the transition from the Medici to the Lorraine Habsburg family. Franz Stefan, who was the husband to Maria Theresa, who, as you know, in 1740 became the head of the Austrian Empire, inherited, well, I guess he was dethroned in Lorraine, and he was pushed into Tuscany, which he took over from Gian Gastone in 1737. Because of these changes, what we see happening that seems unimportant or small in any other context, I think takes inflated importance sometimes in Florentine history. So some of the stuff that we're going to look at are not just reflecting, but they're affecting lives in the 1730s in Florence. Now, the Florentine Freemasons were a convivial dining society. They were central. They reveal the interactions of the grand tourists, the types of sociable life that you would have in Florence. They were a product of the travel and the politics at what we might think of as the golden age, or at least the dawn of the golden age of the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour had been going on for, of course, a long time at this point. But for the British travelers, in the 1740s, late 1740s, it really explodes. The creation of the group occurred also in tandem with a subtle shift in taste, what eventually became Neoclassicism. And I'd argue that the unique interplay of international politics, associational life, and antiquarian and artistic interests in central Italy during this period helped forge the aesthetic language of a new mode, a new classical mode that began to flourish from mid-century onward. And in turn, this new classical mode gave a symbolic language to a particular form of politics that blended free thinking, libertinism, and a brand of republicanism that defined a type of elite culture among young 18th century British travelers. So, let's start with this medal that I have referred to already. This is the medal, 1733. It's relatively small, just about 4.5 centimeters. It features the profile of Charles Sackville, the Earl of Middlesex. Charles Sackville was one of the, you can see him here, he's one of the wealthiest young men in the kingdom, the heir to the Duke of Dorset. He's 22 years old in this image here. He's just out of Oxford. He's on his grand tour with his tutor, Joseph Spence. He loves opera. He's a bit of a poet, a bit of a libertine, and a patron to artists. This medal is known as the Sackville Medal, and you'll notice that it designates him as Magister, a reference to his short term as master of the Florentine Lodge in the summer and fall of 1732. Now, surviving documents give us some information about this lodge. It seems that it was founded by Martin Foulkes, Robert Raymond, the second Baron Raymond, and Lord Middlesex, all three of whom arrived in Florence in the summer of 1732, and who spent extended times during multiple trips to Italy during the 1730s. This is the first manuscript record that we have of the lodge, and it comes from an August 1732 diary entry by Antonio Cocci. And it states that they had an early dinner with Mr. Holdworth. There were other Englishmen. Afterwards, I went to the water, and in the evening I was received among the Freemasons and remained for dinner. Their chief master was Mr. Shirley. The others were Captain Spence, Mr. Clark, Captain Clark, my Lord Middlesex, my Lord Robert Montague, Mr. Froelich, Mr. Collins, Baron Stosh, and the initiates were me, Sir Archer, and Mr. Harris. That's what he says here. And so he gives us a list of a number of the people who were members of the lodge, and with the other documents we can actually figure out who all of, or a good number of the people in the lodge were, and it's a combination of British residents and grand tourists. They range from the super wealthy aristocratic elite to a tavern owner. So it certainly was not for your average person, but nevertheless the membership spanned a number of levels of the social class. They seem to have met fairly regularly. Cocci's diaries suggest this. And the Italian version of Freemasonry that they practiced generally reflected the symbols and rituals that you found in English Freemasonry. So you might have a meeting in which the secrets of the society or the rituals of the society were practiced among its members. Servants were not allowed in, but the other rituals might have been held publicly. And in fact, in 1732, a summons for the members to meet states that, "To all brothers of the Honorable Society of Freemasons, greeting. You are by these signs and tokens required to render yourselves on Friday morning, either by 12 hours at the Villa Septimiane, or by 13 at Maiano, from whence in a regular procession with gloves, aprons, etc., you are to march to Fiesole, where after having examined according to the strict rules of masonry the buildings, pillars, and other noble remains of our art by our brothers the old Romans, there anciently erected, you are to return to Maiano to dine there, and from thence proceed regularly to Villa Septimiane, where the lodge is ordered to be held." So I think what's really interesting about this is that they're actually publicly practicing Freemasonry. They're dressed up in their garb, and they're proceeding through the streets of Florence. Now, clearly they're also interested in the study of antiquity, so that's where I want to turn, because I think that gives us a lot of insight into the group. The first thing that you look at when you see the Sackville Medal is that it seems very classical in nature, and this becomes more apparent when you look at the average medals that were being stamped at roughly the same time. On the right-hand side is a coin or a medal of Gian Gastone de' Medici. This is from 1723, so about 9 years earlier here. And you'll notice that Gian Gastone and Sackville are dressed very, very differently from each other. Gian Gastone is dressed in a contemporary wig. There's an emphasis on form and movement. So if you look at it, his upper body is oblique while his and somewhat facing the viewer, while his head is looking away, suggesting both movement and an action that's taking place out of the frame of the picture. So it's very Baroque, if we're going to use those kinds of labels on Jean Gaston's image. But Middlesex, on the other hand, is presented in a classicized form, wearing the dress of a Roman general. And he had a penchant for, well, actually lots of these guys had a penchant for dressing up. And one of the things that he was well known for was dressing as a Roman general. And in fact, he used this costume for masquerade and masks in Rome and Italy and Florence. And he even had his portrait painted by George Knapton, which hangs across the city in Brooks's Club, for his entry into the Society of Dilettanti, as most members were expected to have presented a portrait. His hair is styled after the coins you might see in ancient Rome. Now, the classicized presentation that you have here of a kind of a very linear presentation, side-facing profile, classical clothing, classical hair, is not necessarily new. It has precedence. If you go over to the British Museum, which Drew and I were over there today, and we looked at some of the medals of Louis XIV, you see something close to this, although you don't have the classicized hair in the medals of Louis XIV. If you go back further and look at Renaissance medals, you'll see this type of representation a bit more. But being innovative is not necessarily the point here. The point is that his contemporaries would have recognized that the form of representation that he was presenting here was a challenge to contemporary aesthetic conventions, which set him apart from his peers. The more immediate precedent for this style can be traced to a new mode of commemorative portraiture that was being developed among antiquaries, collectors, dealers, and artists in central Italy in the first decades of the 18th century, and specifically developing around Baron Philip von Stosch. He wasn't actually a baron, he just styled himself a baron, Philip Stosch, who, as you may recall, was a member of the Florentine Freemasons. And you may even recognize his name. He's the guy on the left here, with Mark Antonio Sabatini on the right. This is one of those caricatures by Getzi, which you see fairly regularly in these decades. He's well remembered as a dealer and collector of antiquities, especially of cameos, intaglios, coins, and medals, both real and faked. He claimed to be able to tell the difference, but he, of course, his business thrived on other people not knowing the difference. He's well known for being a spy in Rome for the Hanover dynasty. And he was actually exposed and banished from Rome in 1731, probably because the Stuarts were tired of him spying on them. And he settled in Florence. From Florence, he ran a spy network in Rome. He continued to run a spy network in Rome. And if you'll notice the dates, 1731, he arrives in Florence just a year before the Florentine Freemasons are established. What we sometimes forget about Stosch is that he was a patron of artists and quite active at cultivating his reputation through commissioning works of art. He's friends with Pier Leone Getzi, who did a portrait of him in 1717, a drawing of a side profile, very similar to the one you see in the Sackville medal. And this drawing, I think, is the model for a new mode of classicizing that we see in Rome and Florence, beginning in the 17-teens. That same year he had that portrait drawn, Giovanni Battista Pozzo designed a medal for Baron Stosch. And as you can see, this is very much in the classical mode that we saw before. The reference on the reverse side of the medal is a quote from Ennius, which states that the Roman state stands strong today due to its morals and noble men. So he's presenting himself as in this kind of civic humanist mode. He's emphasizing close relationship between individual virtue and the strength of the state, which certainly would have appealed to the sensibilities of the British grand tourists. And interestingly enough, that same year, he had that same image done as an intaglio. What he's doing is, I think, attempting to self-promote through selfies. As I take that from Drew too. He mentioned that there were selfies at lunch today. He's trying to affect taste, to transform people's tastes. As a great collector and antiquarian, he knew he could accomplish this both through his cabinet, which people came to visit, and creating items that other people would want in their cabinets, such as this medal on the left, which any person who wants to have a complete collection would need. And speaking of cabinets, of course, this is an incredibly popular and accessible form of art connoisseurship in the 17th and 18th centuries. You can purchase, certainly by the end of the century, you can purchase whole sets of casts of important gems and collections across Europe. There's dozens of books published on the gems and Talio's medals in the collections across Europe. And of course, people were hiring artists to draw their collections, and these drawings circulated. And the reason for this is that you could access these things, you could purchase these items, and you could be a connoisseur of something. So even a middling collector, a clergyman, for example, who might not have huge amounts of money to go to Europe and drop 10,000 pounds in a year on collecting antiquities, they could at least purchase casts or impressions of gems and coins and medals. This is the type of thing that you, actually this is from Stosch's Pierre Antique Gravé. This is from a representation of some of the great intaglios in the collections of the European elite. As you can see, there's precedent for this classicizing mode. And then by 1724, the British start picking up on this. British who are coming in contact with Stosch in Rome and Pozzo in Rome are adapting this mode of the classical portrait into their own medals, which they're stamping while they're on the grand tour. This one is Conyers Middleton, who was the librarian at Cambridge at the time. And on the reverse side of the coin, you can actually see the Library of Cambridge. The story goes that Middleton was unhappy with how the Romans imagined the University of Cambridge. They thought he claimed that they didn't recognize the prestige of Cambridge, and so in order to deal with this, he stamped this medal to kind of evoke the prestige of Cambridge and, of course, himself. 2 years later, another gem was discovered. I'm going to show you lots of pictures, but we're going to move through these gems pretty quickly. This is called the Agathangelos gem. Mark Antonio Sabatini, who you saw in the caricature before, eventually got ownership of this gem. This was one of those gems that became very popular very quickly. Winkelmann referred to this gem as an excellent example of classical design. And so once again, it becomes, it kind of reinforces that classicizing mode of portraiture that you see again and again. Lord Harvey is here representing himself in 1729 on the right. Baron Stosch, again on the bottom in 1727. And I love the quote that he has on the back of this. It's from Horace, which states that to play the madman in accordance with fixed reason and measure. He is definitely the great self-promoter, imagining himself as the voice of reason, but a madman in so doing. In 1726, Stosch acquired a bas-relief, which is represented on the left, engraved by Giovanni Battista Casanova for Winkelmann later for his Monumenti Antichi Inediti, which was published in 1767. He has that bas-relief presented on the flip side of this commemorative coin. It's commemoration of Stosch, but also his great taste in collecting. You'll notice that the figure of Diogenes on the left remains roughly the same, although slightly different with an outstretched arm. The figure on the right, Alexander, is completely different. Part of this may be due to the fact that the right side of the bas-relief was under a restoration at this point. It didn't actually survive intact from antiquity. And you can imagine the guy who imagined himself the voice of reason but still the madman would have associated himself very closely with Diogenes. So this is the kind of very humble character we're dealing with here. Internationally, this mode gets picked up as well. This is a medal from Sweden, which actually commemorates Stosch and his collecting. He didn't actually commission this. The artist designed this for him. This is another book of, this is actually from Ancient Statues. This was published in 1732. Again, you have the picture of Stosch commemorated in the title page, and a number of coins and medals and intaglios done at roughly that same time. So let's move to the reverse side of the Sackville medal. This is where the Freemason symbolism comes to the fore. So what you're looking at here is Harpocrates. He's holding, or he's leaning against a broken column. He's holding his finger to his mouth as if to invoke silence. He's holding a cornucopia. And he's surrounded on the ground with symbols of Freemasonry. And across the top is the Freemason motto from the beginning. Natter, who designed the medal, wasn't simply creating something new, but once again was referring back to antiquity. If there's nothing else that kind of defines neoclassicism, it's this attempt to take from antiquity, refine it, and transform it. Specifically using items from personal collections whenever possible, to be innovative whenever possible. And so, for example, you see the top portion of the Sackville medal borrowing from an intaglio called the Harpocrates intaglio, which Natter produced in a treatise that he did on engraving precious stones in 1754. The top half is certainly modeled on this very specific intaglio. This is actually an intaglio that Natter owned and may have provided him some of the symbolism for the representation as well. This is actually called the Natter Harpocrates, and it's actually at the British Museum. And so effectively, those are the classical models for the medal. Now I want to move on to the political context. When the Florentine Lodge formed in 1732, Jean Gastone de' Medici had been Grand Duke for 12 years. He was childless, which was partly a consequence of a loveless marriage that was arranged for him with Anna Maria Franziska of Saxe-Lauenburg, and partly out of his own sexual preferences. The territory which he ruled had moved away from the close entanglement of state and church, which had characterized his father Cosimo III's rule. Jean Gastone's administration had begun a sequence of reforms that had loosened Rome's control over institutions such as the University of Pisa, an act that had frustrated the papal administration. The state didn't attempt to restrict free thought and had curbed the power of the Inquisition, protecting individuals thought to harbor atheistic and heretical beliefs. And for their part, Jean Gastone's advisors generally saw fit not to restrict free thought and the practice of Freemasonry in Tuscany. Now that said, this doesn't mean that Jean Gastone's administration didn't have close connections with the papacy. In fact, they did. The Medici had used their money to influence the election of the Pope in 1730. And Clement XII, as Lorenzo Corsini restyled himself, consequently owed a debt of gratitude to the Medici. And this was also the case with Clement XII's nephew, Cardinal Neri Maria Corsini. Cosimo III had appointed Neri to be the Tuscan ambassador to France, then England, earlier in the century, and now he was the right-hand advisor to the Pope. So there's this close connection between the Medici and the rulers in Rome. Now, good relations with Rome were important to Tuscan diplomacy. That being the case, a childless Jean Gastone left Tuscany prey to the ambitions of the great powers. In the 17 teens, with no prospects of heirs, Cosimo III attempted to supersede Tuscan law by enacting legislation to put Gian Gastoni's sister, the Electress Palatine Anna Maria Luisa, on the throne in the event of his death. But he was rebuffed by the great powers, who wanted descent to eventually pass to either the Bourbons or the Habsburg line. And ultimately matters were decided by war. The treaties at the end of the War of Spanish Succession. Oh, there's Gian Gastoni in bed. He's rumored to rarely have left bed. So there he is. I just love that picture of Gian Gastoni there. Sorry, I'm going to have to move to the next slide to show you a map, which is a lot more exciting. The treaties at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, specifically the Treaty of London, ignored Cosimo III's interests. The Quadruple Alliance of Britain, France, Austria, and the United Provinces decreed that Tuscany would eventually pass to the Bourbon Spanish monarchy. Those in the Tuscan administration who were planning for the future then began to align themselves with the King and Queen of Spain, Philip V, and Elisabetta Farnese. Horace Mann referred to this group of people within Florence as the Orsi faction, those who aligned themselves with the Spanish. Then, in a change of fortune in the 1730s, the defeat of Stanislaw Leszczynski, claimant to the Polish throne, by Russian and Austrian forces in the War of Polish Succession, set off a chain of events that altered the line of succession in Tuscany. France used the war as an opportunity to seize the Duchy of Lorraine, expecting, of course, that they could annex it upon the death of Stanislaw, who they gave it to. The deposed Duke of Lorraine, who was Franz Stefan, soon to be wed to Maria Theresa of Austria, and who was heir to the Spanish throne, would receive Tuscany in exchange for Lorraine. Instead of the Spanish, Tuscany would then get Habsburg Lorrainers. On the ground in Tuscany, this meant that the Spanish and Habsburg factions emerged. The Papal States favored Spanish succession in order to block the Habsburg advance in Italy, which included control over Parma and Milan. And still in 1737, the Habsburgs had retained control of Naples and Sicily. So the Habsburg had a fairly substantial presence in Italy. As Gian Gastoni approached the end of his life, an internal struggle for power in Tuscany began. Rome moved first, hoping to halt the advance of liberalism in Tuscany with the entry of Franz Stefan and, of course, the Austrians. One area of focus was Freemasonry, supposed to be a key vector for the introduction of free thought and atheism throughout Europe. And importantly, Franz Stefan, the future Grand Duke, was himself a Freemason and had been inducted into English Freemasonry in 1733 while at The Hague. An attack on Freemasonry was therefore symbolically important in the broader struggle over succession and power in Tuscany. It might undermine atheism and humble Franz Stefan. Moving against the Florentine Lodge had a more immediate practical benefit as well. One of its most outspoken and unloved members was Baron Stosch, whom Antonio Cocchi, who was supposedly friends with this guy, called a nasty, vicious man and a teller of fables invented by him. Stosch was a spy for the British and had been expelled from Rome in 1731, as you recount, and his work entailed sending reports to the Walpole administration about the Stuart court in Rome. So ideally, they could break Stosch's spy network by going after the Freemasons as well. By 1737, it was clear that Gian Gastoni was on his deathbed. The Roman forces began to align themselves in Tuscany, and they began to capture as many rumors and maybe even generate some rumors for themselves. And there were plenty of rumors to be had. Rumors which ranged from stories of drunken revels to sexual improprieties to religious heterodoxy to atheism. The British founders of the lodge had long established their reputations for excess drinking and sexual appetites, and this no doubt characterized the lodge in its early years. It seems, however, that several members of the Florentine intelligentsia, including Antonio Cocchi and Baron Stosch, contributed to the lodge's reputation as a bed of heresy. As early as 1731, John Harvey, the second Baron Harvey, who you saw in that the cameo, wrote to Baron Holland that Kochi and he should be acquaintances because you will like him because he has no affection, and he you because you have no belief. Horace Walpole confirmed this perspective in a letter to Mon in 1753, noting that Kochi was a very free thinker and suspected by the Inquisition. Even Fawkes, one of the lodge's masters, first founders, noted Kochi's tendency towards heterodoxy. Recounting a conversation with Martin Fawkes to George Louis Tessier in 1735, the first Earl of Egmont wrote, Dr. Tessier read to Mr. Fawkes and me a letter he had received from a very ingenious friend, now traveler at Florence, where among many curious remarks he adds that all the learned men in the city are so notorious atheists that they own it in all company without fear of the Inquisition. And even to the first they meet with, though a stranger, as to him in particular, to whom they blame the English nation for not going far enough, but still superstitiously believing in a deity. So, as you can see, these rumors are circulating about libertinism, about atheism, and the papacy was able to pick up on this. Papal allies actually convinced the ailing Jean Gaston that Freemasonry was a threat to the state in early June 1737, and several suspected Florentine Freemasons were arrested and questioned. The Inquisition's methods were so severe that it immediately led to an outrage against Rome's moves, and Rome pulled back very quickly. When Jean Gaston died in July of 1737, the Regency Council was led by this guy here. There he is, the Prince de Craon. And he was responsible for acting on behalf of Franz Stefan, who hadn't yet visited Tuscany and would arrive only in the next year. The other members of the Council of the Regency included Richcourt, who was head of the finances, and Rinuccini, who was responsible for war, and Rucellai, who was the secretary of ecclesiastical affairs. Richcourt wrote an analysis of the situation in July 1737, claiming that the Tuscan state was too close to the Inquisition and that it was corrupt, serving the interests of Rome and the Medici faction. He outlined the position of the Regency Council that the sovereign is constituted by God to judge his subjects, defend the innocent, and punish the guilty. No one has power over them. In other words, the new government aimed to break the remaining political power that the papacy held over Tuscany, and this was met with satisfaction in the London papers, for example. So this pushed Rome to move even further, and in 1738, Clement XII released a bull that stated that Freemasonry was banned in all the Catholic kingdoms in response to this, at which point Franz Stefan refused to print it in the Tuscan provinces. So this is a standoff over Freemasonry, but truly a standoff over politics as well, happening at the same time. So, in the midst of this power struggle in Florence, the Habsburg-Lorraine faction attempted to put their own clients into positions of authority. So Rinuccini tried to get Kochi, Dr. Kochi, a place at court, but the papal nuncio opposed it. So instead, Kochi was appointed the antiquary to the state and the guardian of the medals, which brings us back to those medals that we started out with. This he won against a competitor, the famed antiquary Gori. And Gori was not chosen, even though probably much more suited for the job, because he was aligned with Rome. So this political alliance is playing itself out in the medal cabinets as well. Kochi took one of two positions at the Uffizi. and he attempted to begin a reform of the galleries, which was a microcosm of all the reforms that the Habsburg-Lorrainers were putting into effect across Florence and Tuscany. So you can see the responses to Cocchi's reform were very similar to the responses of the reforms that Franz Stefan was trying to initiate. Now, 1 year later, in the spring of 1739, the machinations of the papacy were still in motion. There were still rumors that Franz Stefan might resign and hand power over to Spain. So this Spanish faction, this Orsi faction, is still in existence in Tuscany. They also pressured the new administration to allow the Inquisitor to arrest two members of the Freemasons, Tommaso Crudeli and Antonio Buondelamente, who happened to be the nephew of Rucellai and was saved because he was the nephew of one of the Regency Council members. These arrests were unexpected by Franz Stefan. It seems the first commentators thought that Franz Stefan had actually ceded to the wishes of the papacy, but in fact what happened was he was attempting to limit the Inquisition's authority, and instead of having Rome work with the secretary of the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, he wanted them to work with a secular authority and force the Inquisition to deal with the Secretary of State. Unfortunately for Crudeli, who was arrested and imprisoned, the Secretary of State was closer to Rome than the ecclesiastical secretary, surprisingly enough, and immediately conformed to the wishes of the papacy. The papacy also wanted to arrest foreign visitors suspected of Freemasonry. Lord Middlesex, the Sackville Medal guy, came up as a potential candidate for arrest. Baron Stosch was, of course, a candidate for arrest. You can imagine what kind of diplomatic troubles this would cause if the Grand Duke of Tuscany were to turn over foreign visitors to the papacy. So instead, they made a deal. Baron Stosch was given 3 days to leave Florence, and no foreigners would be arrested by the Inquisition. What actually happened, though, was that the British intervened. Horace Mann, who was representative in Florence, asked the Grand Duke for a reprieve, and George II actually wrote a letter to the Grand Duke to protect Stosch and keep him in Florence. So it's a pretty high-level intervention that took place. Gives you a sense of how closely Stosch was integrated into the affairs of politics. Now, Crudeli's arrest, though. Crudeli had no protection. He was a poet. It took some time, in fact, except his closest friends, for him to seem people even to notice that he was missing. But when it did, poor guy, can you imagine walking down the street? There's actually a story. He gets picked up on his way home one night, and nobody notices. But when it did become public, it quickly circulated throughout town in public places. Cocchi mentions specifically the print shops is where information is being circulated about the arrest. And Crudeli's friends were actually successful at smuggling out correspondence from the prisoner, which told what happened. And this is what Crudeli wrote. The papacy believed that there is a society kept by Stosch of about 60 people where they practice very bawdy actions and teach impious dogmas. Equals, I don't know what that means, but meaning freak and bug one another and say that there is no God and the Pope is dead. They say they have two witnesses who are of the society who have deposed against him and claimed that they know, okay, this becomes third person now, they know who freaked him when he was received, but masturbated. I don't think that's a common word. I had not seen that before anyway. They suppose at the reception the candidate is to be freed, and he is to write his own seed, with his own seed, his oath. So this recalls those rumors about the beggar's benison, if you're familiar with this group. It's not known whether it is a calumny or a mistake. Stosh is a nasty, vicious man and a teller of fables invented by him. So this is Cauchy talking about Stosh, which might have given occasion to the first supposition. And the second seems to be utterly false. So effectively, they're not having these sexual rituals. It's utterly false. And it appears that the papacy had found two people who were willing to turn Crudeli in, and they escaped to Rome. There was no way to get them. Cauchy recounts that they headed off to Rome. Effectively, the papacy combined rumors of free thinking and sexual libertinage, which seem to have not only followed the British grand tourists as they traveled through Europe, in fact, they actively promoted these reputations, and they used these rumors to accuse the Florentine Freemasons and thus arrest them in an attempt at a larger plan to seize power in Florence. Now, just to conclude, if you remember, the story started out with a little 4.5 centimeter medal, seemingly forgettable. If you're walking past this at the British Museum, I certainly don't imagine that you would stop to look at this particular medal. But it tells a pretty interesting story, I think. Exploring the social history of this medal reveals that it's at the center of an aesthetic shift taking place in the tastes of young British grand tourists and Italian literati during the first decades of the 18th century. And I'd argue that this shift is important in our understanding in the development of Neoclassicism. It points to the importance of one of the most common and popular ways that classical aesthetics entered the vocabulary. And these small medals, intaglios, and coins are relatively ignored pieces of material culture in contemporary historiography and probably deserve a little more research. It also indicates the importance of sociability and clubbability in maintaining and transforming taste. It shows how international networks, especially Italian networks, were to what we might think of as the British aesthetic Enlightenment. An Enlightenment that would never be articulated through a theoretical framework to any great extent, like we have in the French Academy, but a framework which was nevertheless deeply engaged in continental discussions and debates over aesthetics. This story also gives us a history of the first Freemason lodge in Italy, which is itself important to understanding the development of new spaces of 18th century sociability. In this case, it seems to have been a vector for the introduction of free thought, Epicureanism, religious heterodoxy, and atheism. And there's this interesting and odd juxtaposition in British elite circles during the first half of the 18th century between these radical ideas, and a deep aristocratic conservatism that they sit side by side with. And finally, this study gives insights into the complex politics of 18th century Italy and some of the ways in which Britons and the British government were implicated. And more importantly, it reveals close ties between social relationships, cultural phenomena, and material culture, and how the micropolitics of gem and metal making, associational life, patronage, and antiquarianism intersected with the macropolitics of international affairs. So I'm going to stop there and take questions.